Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Virtual Power Teams podcast. Today, we have another exciting guest. His name is Stephan Wiedner. That will be the German pronunciation. Maybe the Americans will call it Wiedner. You tell us. But what is more important than how to pronounce his surname, he's an entrepreneur. He would tell us about his ventures. He's an applied researcher. Particularly, he deeply cares about how people feel at work. So he is doing research and makes sure and cares about people feeling well at work. And if they feel well, the performance comes. And last but not least, he's an ice maker. What does it mean? You will find out in a moment. He lives in Canada, so there must be somebody producing the ice. So, Steph, welcome to our podcast. Please tell us with your own words who you are and what you do.
Well, Peter, thanks for the introduction. Yes, I'm responsible for all the ice in Canada, and we have lots of it. No kidding, obviously. I was just telling Peter that in my small little community here, we're getting a bit of a cold snap, and we have a great facility down by the beach in our community park for an ice rink. And so I've taken that on. I'm also a member of the local fire department. So the fire department generously allows me to grab whatever hoses and tools I need to go and put some water down on a concrete pad. And lo and behold, nature does its thing and turns it into ice, and kids and families can skate on it. So that's a nice
fire
little...
and ice. You have the both yin and yang.
Fire and ice. There you go. So that's a little part of me, and it's an important part of me because I used to live in the city, and moving to a more rural part of the country has been a really great opportunity for our family to be able to really feel like we can be on the front lines contributing and being, purpose-driven individuals within the community. So we really pride ourselves on being part of the community, contributing to the community, as opposed to just being benefactors. And so that's a lot easier to do when you're in a small community where you kind of know a lot of people and so on. And aside for that, that really ties into my purpose as someone who is looking to build psychological safety within organizations. Ultimately, it's about making individuals feel like their voice matters at work. And I believe there's a Gallup poll that suggests that something like 70% of people feel like their voice doesn't matter at work. So when they show up to work, they're just punching the clock. They are simply putting in their time. And that to me is a missed opportunity, because all of those folks have innovative ideas. They have a lot of energy that they could be contributing if there was just an opportunity to do so. Yes. So that's my raison d'etre. That's my reason for doing the work I do, Peter.
Excellent. I've come across a research which says the same, that 70% of the people are not engaged, and depends by country. America and USA, they were the most engaged in this study with 30%. Japan, for example, was only 10% are engaged, and so on. So it's not exactly the same, but similar. If you don't think your voice matters, you wouldn't be engaged, proactive, and so on. So you've mentioned psychological safety. Let's just define for our listeners. They already know the Google project Aristotle. We explained a little bit in the other podcast about importance of feeling safe to take risks, to be vulnerable. But you're an applied researcher. Define for us the psychological safety in the most pragmatic way.
Well, and I also want to just say about applied researcher, I'm not a researcher myself, right? So I like to look at the research that is available and then try to apply it as much as possible. So be evidence-based and data-driven in our work. So just want to qualify that, make sure everyone's on the same page as far as what that means. And when it comes to psychological safety, we have a couple definitions. The first is the one provided by Amy Edmondson, who you've likely discussed before, especially around Project Aristotle. Her definition of psychological safety is that it's a belief that within your team or within your work environment, you can speak up, say what's on your mind, even admit mistakes. And you're able to do that without the fear of reprimand. So you're not fearing some form of negative consequence because you speak up. And our definition, the one that we use in all of our training and in our work, is that, especially for leaders and managers, your goal is to create an environment where everyone has the courage to speak up and the confidence that when they do speak up, they'll be heard. So it's creating that sort of an environment. Does that make sense, Peter?
Absolutely. No, great definition. Courage to speak up and guarantee that they will be heard. And this is, this is the leader's role to create and enable this environment. Now, tell us why psychological safety. Tell us your story. What was the defining moment that you said, okay, now I will focus on psychological safety. I will focus that, people are heard, their voice is heard. What was the moment in your career, in your life, when you make this, decision?
Yeah, well, we were doing a bunch of work with coaching, so executive coaching, leadership coaching, and we were providing leaders and organizations with really great coaching. And in order to substantiate that coaching, because organizations were paying good money for this type of work, I wanted to be able to say, look, we can measure the impact. And so often people go through the experience of coaching and they know they get good value out of it. They know that they've transformed or, readjusted how they're looking at their work and how they're leading, et cetera. And we wanted to be able to demonstrate that, look, there's a measurable outcome here. And when I came across the concept of psychological safety, what I loved about it is that it can be measured, and it can be measured relatively easily and quickly. And so I thought, there was the light bulb moment for me is, here is ultimately something that we can measure before and after coaching. But more importantly, that thing that we would measure is correlated with outcomes. So we know that the most innovative teams, the most successful teams are the teams with the highest degree of psychological safety. And conversely, the lowest performing teams are the teams with the lowest degree of psychological safety. And so that was the light bulb moment. That was when I thought, oh gosh. And also, when you look back, of course, 2020 vision, I was looking back at all these coaching engagements that we had done, and the stated goal for each one of those was always something like to be a better delegator, to improve executive presence, to improve communication skills, to be a better listener, et cetera. And ultimately, all of those leaders were trying to build psychological safety, even though we didn't describe it as such. Really, that's what they wanted. They wanted their teams to be able to feel more engaged, to be able to speak up, to share their ideas. And so that was the impetus for us to focus on this concept called psychological safety.
Fantastic. And I love that you say it's measurable. I'm a master of mathematics. I like to measure things and have formula for everything. If you have formula for psychological safety, please do share. But my question is, what is on the formula if there is one? How can you measure it? Can you give us examples of the impact from psychological safety, just to see the correlation? You establish psychological safety, then you deliver project faster, or whatever metrics you have come across.
So what additional metrics are impacted or influenced by increasing psychological safety? Is that the question?
Yes. If not additional, yes. Which are the parameters, which are the KPIs that get changed when you enable and establish psychological safety?
Well, it really depends on the team. So if you look at a larger organization, I like to think of an organizational map, almost like a weather map. So imagine a map of your country, and on the evening news, they're saying, oh, today we've got a flurry coming in from the west, and right, you're going to have different pockets. So in the one area, you might have sunny skies, and in another area, you have rain. And so if you think about a larger organization with multiple teams, you're going to have different degrees of psychological safety. And I think a weather map is a good metaphor, because you might want to relate psychological safety to temperature. So where it's really cold, then you have low levels of psychological safety. When it's nice and warm, you have high levels of psychological safety. So it's dependent on the team. And and then the KPIs you're measuring are obviously going to be different if you're a sales team versus a marketing team versus a new product innovation team. So I'll give you a case study to help illustrate the impact and the value of psychological safety. There's an organization that they are the incumbents when it comes to their products in large box retail shops. So they create retail products, and they have lots of shelf space. So every year their sales are solid and stable, and their organization's been around a long time. And so that's what their whole organization is built around, stabilizing their revenue and making sure that competitors don't come along and oust their products. That said, they recognize that the future of their organization in terms of growth is really pitted around their new product innovation team. And their new product innovation team needs to create new products, and ideally products that have some form of protectable IP. So that requires some experimentation, that requires innovation. And that particular team had a really hard time within their organization because their organization was very risk averse, right? Because they want to protect the 98% of their revenue that comes from existing products. And so when you have a whole organization that's relatively risk averse, every team, from the legal team to the marketing team to the branding teams, they're all wanting to make sure every T is crossed and every I is dotted. And then along comes this rogue innovation team, and they're like, yeah, let's do some experimentation. Let's throw a web page up there and see what kind of language sticks. And the rest of the team, the branding teams, are like, whoa, what are you doing? Like, slow down there, cowboy. We haven't had legal review this stuff. We don't know if this language is infringing on other products and trademarks and all this sort of stuff. And so that team felt completely almost like bound by a straitjacket. And so they needed to develop psychological safety within their organization in order to facilitate the conversations to say, hey, look, we have much different values, our team, compared to the rest of the organization. And we need to be experimental. We need to try new things. Otherwise, we're not going to develop these new products, which is a large mandate for the organization. And so just having those two cultures within one broader culture, like a product innovation culture versus a protective, risk-averse culture, that requires psychological safety. Is that helpful, Peter, as an example?
Absolutely. No, great example. Do you have some numbers, in terms of not yet revenue and so on, but if you have a benchmark, like introducing like time to market for new product before and after psychological safety, or any number that you measured before and after implementing it?
Yeah, well, I think it really depends on the organization. So a really good one might be new products brought to market, right? It depends on if your organization's large enough and you're trying lots of experimentation, you may want to look at how many new products do we bring to market every year.
Yes.
And you also may want to look at sales quotas. And
yes,
for a sales team, obviously a sales team needs to make greater sales. And where psychological safety matters the most is in environments where you need to learn a lot. So you might want to ask yourself, like in a sales department, sure, you want to make more sales, but maybe the thing you want to focus on is closing more of the leads that you currently have. That requires a certain amount of learning, right? Because if you're doing the exact same thing, you're going to get roughly the same conversion rate.
Yes.
Whereas maybe you say, okay, look, we're going to get the same number of leads in this coming month. How might we convert an extra 5% of those leads or an extra 10% of those leads? That sort of discussion is facilitated by psychological safety, because you want to hear from all your salespeople. Like, well, what ideas do you have? And I don't know, how can you close one more deal this month? What might you need to do differently? We're not going to give you any additional leads, but how can you close one more? Those are the kinds of conversations that you want to have psychological safety facilitate.
So any kind of internal transformation, or even not transformation, but improvement, is facilitated, like psychological safety is a catalyst for those essential processes.
Yeah.
When you were talking, I recently had a study. We live in a very agile and dynamic world, and companies, exactly like you mentioned, they recruit new people to drive innovation. And usually these are like digital products, digitizing the customer engagement and so on. So digital times to market. And what happened in this particular company, after 1 year, those people who come with a proven track record, great ideas, they were like antibody, they were like ejected by the organization because they were not accepted. And those were great people. The organization, spent a lot of money in vain. So I think that's where psychological safety can help exactly to facilitate the process and ensure culturally, apparently, have different values and different culture, as you mentioned. How can you, create a collaborative and cooperative environment? So yes, these are great insights. The more specific you are, the better. Let me just ask you, that was a great example. What was your most exciting, let's say, case study or project that you work on establishing psychological safety?
Well, let me come back to a comment you made there,
Yes.
Peter, about these people that were brought on and then they left.
Mm-hmm.
Like, why did they leave? You said the organization kind of spit them back out. Why do you think they left?
I don't have exact, but I used to work for this company, and then following up and catching up with my colleagues, it turned out that this actually happened. And it is, again, very strong, risk-averse company with, strong portfolio and so on. It's been done like this for hundreds of years, and all of a sudden come people which, want to change many things. So it was exactly not facilitating this discussion. Apparently, they are not willing to change their mindset because this is what makes them successful. And nobody took care to kind of welcome them and see how 1+1 could be 3, leveraging on our strengths. So it's been a fight and not really a cooperative discussion. That's my reading.
Yeah, well, and what do we know about people leaving is often when they leave an organization, they're not leaving the organization, they're leaving their manager.
Yes.
So do they have a manager that's standing up for them and listening to them, right? We're coming back to that very thing we started with, which is, do people have a voice? So if the organization is incredibly risk averse and then they're hiring these folks to be innovators, and those innovators aren't given the voice, they aren't given the tools to actually do the work that they've been contracted to do, they're eventually going to leave, right? Yes. Those product innovators are going to move to another organization. So back to your question about a case study, sure. So one of the organizations that we've probably done the most amount of work is in the banking and finance industry. Mm-hmm. And so as you could appreciate, that organization is also very risk averse. And they're really from the top down embracing psychological safety, which is so amazing. Because they're making it a real priority for their culture and for their organization, because they want to create much more of an innovative, fail-safe work environment. As you could also appreciate within banking and finance, there's a lot of technology that's coming along, right? And there's a lot of disruptors. And so they need to be innovative in an industry that has been traditionally very conservative. And so it's a big adjustment. And what's so interesting also in that environment is there are so many really kind of data-driven, analytical types of individuals. And many of them sure appreciate psychological safety as a concept, and yet have a challenge enacting it, right? Bringing it forward because they're so sort of data-driven and analytical, and not necessarily, their strength isn't necessarily engaging people.
Yes.
Yeah, or empathy, right? It's not necessarily their strong suit. And it's not that they lack empathy. It's not like they're unable to be empathetic. It's just not necessarily their fast lane, yes. If you will. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so that's been a real interesting evolution in our work and in the way that psychological safety is being embraced in that organization. It takes, one thing I can say about psychological safety, especially for larger organizations, is it takes time. It takes an ongoing commitment. So it's not something that you just go out and buy, now you have, because psychological safety is kind of a fluid thing. It changes with time. And so it takes continuous effort and adjustment and mindfulness around, okay, are we maintaining this environment of psychological safety where folks can really speak up? So that's been a really fun and ongoing case study, Peter.
Yes. Can you tell us a little bit how long it takes to establish? For sure, it all depends on the size and everything, but just a bit on the how long it takes, what would be the key phases you go through? Do you do top down or mixed? Just anything on the how in order to get from kind of no or poor psychological safety to more embraced psychological safety.
Yeah. I think a good benchmark is that it takes years. So I want to plant that seed first for folks. So you can make significant inroads within a year, and it likely takes years of ongoing effort. But of course, it depends on the size of your organization. So if you have a team of 8 or 10 people and that's it, that's the entirety of the organization, you can obviously make change much, much more quickly. In a perfect world, we can start from the top down. Why? Why is that? Because we know that leaders have an outsized influence on psychological safety because there's this power dynamic. So perhaps the listeners here can all relate to being both the leader of a team, but also being a member of a team. And then also recognizing power differential. So when someone's, 1 or 2 or 3 levels up, just think about being in a meeting like that, like being in a meeting, let's say at the board level versus being in a meeting where it's more at the product level. If you're at the board level and you have much more senior people, how likely are you to speak up, right? How likely are you to express some sort of concern or error? Answer that question, Peter. What comes to mind when I say that?
Yeah, unless you prep the people, unless the leader themselves show vulnerability, admit mistakes, people wouldn't do it. It takes really by example and, to see more conservative people, to see that other people speak up, they don't get fired or demoted. So it takes few iterations. But yes, it was great way so if you want to start top down in ideal world, what would you do?
Yeah, so we would start by working with the senior leadership team, whether it's the executive committee or the senior management, whatever the name you provide for that particular team. And we start by number one, measuring psychological safety, as we mentioned already. And that's the first step. And once we measure it, we then debrief the results with the group. So we want to understand, how do we get to this score? So for example, if let's say the score out of 100 is 75, we want to know, okay, well, how do we get there? And when we look at that score, we can also see the range of scores. So for example, if 8 out of 8 people on the senior leadership team all measure psychological safety as 75, well, obviously your average score is 75 and your range is very small. Well, in that case, it would be 0. But if you have some people who feel like it's a 90 or 95% and others who feel like it's more like a 60 or 55%, suddenly your average is still 75, but you have a much broader range of scores, right? So the variety or the amount of difference that people feel around the concept of psychological safety is broader. We have more to discuss there, right? There's less agreement around how psychologically safe the work environment is. And we need to unpack that. Like, why is that? Why are some people feeling high psychological safety and other people feeling low? And we found all sorts of interesting findings there. Like sometimes the CEO feels the most psychological safety, obviously, because they're at the top and they think, oh, we have a great team here and we can all share openly. And then other times I've had the CEO feel like the lowest level of psychological safety because they feel like their words are being scrutinized and they're trying to be so careful with everything they say so as not to cause any rupture in the organization, right? They don't want to insult anybody when their intention is absolutely not to do so. So that's the first step, is debriefing the results. And then we want to look at, okay, well, how can we build more psychological safety in this team? And we want to co-create that. We want to co-create those goals and tie those in to the bigger organizational goals. So often when we do this work, we're doing it around quarterly planning sessions or annual planning sessions. And we start that initiative off, because if you're going into planning sessions and people aren't feeling psychological safety, how good are the results you're going to come up with, right? How good are the strategies and the plans that you develop when, maybe someone in the sales department's going, I think this is a terrible idea. How am I supposed to sell this product? You're just giving me a product no one's asking for this product. Everyone's asking for that product, and you're giving me this product. How am I supposed to achieve my sales goals, right? If they don't say that, if they think, okay, fine, I'll do my best, I guess, right? If they're resigned, then the results aren't going to be great. So we try to tie the goals of the organization back to psychological safety and go from there.
Yeah, that relates also to the question, how do you measure? Essentially, you measure the success on the goals, with psychological safety. Do you have any data on retaining key people? Because we mentioned usually if you don't have psychological safety, some good people may leave, and that would slow down process. Any correlation in your work so far on retention or?
We haven't got good enough data on that just yet. Like, we don't have enough data, and we're currently working on a study. And that study is looking at correlating psychological safety and interpersonal skills of a manager. Yes. So we're able to measure both of those two things. Now, the interpersonal skills, this is a really interesting one. Like, how do you measure someone's interpersonal skills? And we measure someone's interpersonal skills by exposing them to challenging clips within a team. And so when they watch a video of a challenging moment, the video then stops after, say, 30 seconds or 60 seconds. And now their web camera turns on and they need to respond. So how do you respond in that particular moment? As if they were in the team and being the manager. Yeah. And then we look at their responses and we can code them. So we can actually measure their interpersonal skills, because we have a coding manual and we know what we're looking for. And then we can correlate that with psychological safety. And one of the additional pieces that we're looking to measure are other engagement metrics, because the concept is that those engagement metrics will likely correlate very strongly with psychological safety as well. And one of those is, of course, engagement and turnover. So we don't have that data just yet, but we're working on collecting it, and should hopefully have some results in probably about 4 to 6 months from now, once we go through the data collection process. We're just currently submitting our study application to the ethics board. So we're getting everything reviewed, and we'll have some better findings. But I think the hypothesis is I think that probably is what you're thinking, right? Leaders that can build psychological safety are likely to have much lower turnover. Is that sort of the genesis of your question, Peter?
Yes. And we are in the war for talent. So this is quite a strong proposition. If you could retain the top talents, you are on a much better position, particularly in digital industries where the late Steve Jobs says, the good program is like 100 or 1,000 times better than an average programmer. So you'd like to keep really this talented, analytical, algorithmical people.
Yeah, keep and retain. Keep, and attract, rather. Keep and attract. One of the organizations that we're looking to start working with in the new year, they're in that exact position. So they're a successful organization. They're growing. They doubled their people in the last 18 months. And what they recognize is we have really good people and we want to keep them. So we want to make sure that we're creating psychological safety, that our managers are getting trained so that they're really listening, because they see that as a necessary ingredient for keeping their people. Yes. They're not going to be able to scale their organization if they can't attract that talent and keep their existing talent. Yes. For them, losing one person is really, really costly.
Yes. Tell us a bit, is there any technology currently that can enable, that can support establishing psychological safety? You mentioned your measuring survey, which is not exactly tech, but it's still something that makes it systematic. So any systems, tools, or technology that can enable psychological safety?
Yeah, good question. And we have a sister company. So we have, me and my business partner, we have two companies. One of them is called skillsetter.com. And Skillsetter is a technology platform for practicing interpersonal skills. So when you think about psychological safety, we already discussed the definition, right? It's the belief that within your team, you can speak up and say what's on your mind. Well, what's going to control or what's going to affect your sense of psychological safety in this moment? It's a culmination of all of the interactions that you've had over the last week, over the last month, over the last year, right? And it could be email communication, it could be communication in a team. Like all of these forms of communication are giving you social cues that say it's okay or it's not okay to speak up in this work environment. And so what we are focusing on to foster and build psychological safety is helping managers improve their interpersonal skills. And so many people think that interpersonal skills, you either have them or you don't, right? Someone's charismatic or they're not. And we embrace the growth mindset around that and recognize that interpersonal skills can be learned if you have the right tools. And one of those tools is skillsetter.com, where individuals can look at stimulus clips. So we're sort of engineering these environments, right? These team-based scenarios, engineering them, and then allowing people to practice responding and seeing how they respond. And they can, and in that software, it's almost like Duolingo for interpersonal skills. You can practice again and again and again, and you get different stimulus videos and you practice one skill at a time. And so then over time, you build up your capacity to interact with others in a powerful, meaningful way that fosters psychological safety.
Excellent. That's fantastic. Fantastic. So, because it's a virtual Power Teams podcast and psychological safety, you may kind of argue that it's even more difficult to establish in virtual teams where they don't see each other every day and don't know, and unless the manager do some conscious formats, they may even don't get to know each other at all. But what would be your number one advice, maybe related to psychological safety, maybe not, for leaders of virtual teams? What would be your top advice?
Well, this is not anything new. The first piece, which is obviously in virtual teams, like you already said, you're not seeing people in the hallway or in the kitchen or lounge. So you lose a lot of data, and you need to be a lot more intentional with creating time to check in with all of your staff members and your team members and colleagues. So that's the first thing. So being more intentional with your time. And then the second that I would add, which is maybe something a little less commonly spoken about, is when you're interacting with your team members, individuals, or within a group, you want to be finely attuned to psychological safety. So finely attuned to what might be causing one or more people within that environment to withhold information, to not be speaking up, and just start paying attention to that. Maybe there's someone in the team that tends to speak up all the time and dominate the conversation. Well, how do you manage that? Because is that affecting the other folks on the team who are thinking, well, I don't need to say anything because so-and-so is just going to speak up and fill the void anyway, right? Or maybe there's been some conflict in the past and people are really hesitant to speak up because they don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. There's all sorts of dynamics that might be happening, and it's really important that you pay attention to those. And if there are any issues, you bring them up, you shine a big fat light on them, and you say, okay, what's going on here? So that would be my advice. And for managers and leaders, especially in that virtual environment that you're talking about, Peter.
Excellent. Thank you. Now, last two questions. What do you read or listen at the moment? It's like a standard question, just to get some inspiration to our listeners.
Sure. Well, listening, I really love the long-lasting podcast called This American Life. If you're not familiar with it, they just talk about all sorts of interesting topics relating to, I guess, life in the United States, life in America. And it's a nice listen because I find that I do also listen to a number of work-related podcasts around culture and team building and all these sorts of things. But it's nice to listen to something that is not work-related sometimes.
Yes.
I don't know if you share that same experience. And then the other thing that relating to reading and books, the book I just completed it was called something like The Voices That Whisper in the Night. And it's about an adventurer, an outdoor adventurer type individual who goes out and does all kinds of crazy canoe trips and hiking trips, etc. And in this particular case, he's doing a trip in Labrador, which is in Eastern Canada. Mm-hmm. And he's exploring some of the old reports of these like supernatural beings that the old pioneers encountered in the forest. And he's scratching his head going, what's up with all of these reports of these crazy mystical beings? And so he comes up with some really interesting findings. I was a little bit surprised by the end of that story. So that was a good read.
Is he claiming that there is some, extra consciousness?
Well, I don't want to give it away, Peter, but the short answer is no. Yeah, okay. But he helps. He's more of like he's a historian, and he likes to look at old legends and how they evolve. So he's sort of explaining how you might have these stories of, like in Canada, we have these stories of, the Sasquatch or, these abominable snowman kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And he's really trying to explore, like, what's the source of those mm-hmm. stories and how do they come about? And in this case, it's a real practical, because he has really practical evidence. He has these written stories of really science-minded individuals, like researchers and also doctors that are in the wilderness writing what it is that they're seeing and experiencing, and then exploring how those stories get manipulated over time. It's a little bit like, the telephone game where you whisper into one person's ear and then they whisper to someone else and so on. And by the end, the story is completely distorted. It's like that. So storytelling starts with the genesis of something real and tangible. And it just kind of morphs into, wow, there's this mystical being and everybody knows about it.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, last question. What is the future of virtual teams? Now we have hybrid as a kind of subcategory. How do you forecast the future of how would they evolve?
Wow, that's a good question. I think that virtual teams are going nowhere, right? Like we're going to get more of them, mm-hmm. especially in high-tech environments where I think a lot of the power is in the employees, right? Where the employees who want to work virtually and remotely from wherever it is that they live in the world, the demand is going to go up, right? Because the employers are, they're the buyers and the employees are the sellers, if you will. And the power is going to shift towards those employees, especially super technical, high-tech type individuals. And I believe the research suggests, Peter, that the best employees are going to be the best employees, whether they work remotely or not. Mm-hmm. And so I think you can have really powerful virtual teams 100%, mm-hmm. even though maybe traditionally a lot of leaders might think, no, you need people to be in the same work environment. I don't think that's the case. Now, I guess it depends on what it is that you're trying to do. There's always going to be some businesses that people need to be together because there's some sort of physical good. But if you're working on anything digital, why not? So I just see more and more virtual teams emerging.
Excellent.
Is that also your experience, Peter? Or
that's my experience as well. Yeah, I've bet on that like 9 years ago, starting virtual power teams, and it's materializing. And COVID actually accelerated a bit the process.
Oh, big time, didn't it?
Yes.
A big time.
Another just now, some companies go asynchronous. So whenever you like, wherever you like virtual, you can choose the location. We have many adopters, but now, whenever, kind of minimizing the synchronous time to 10% or less, and for the rest, they can work whenever. So there is a processes and tools and way. Do you think this trend will also prevail, allowing where not only, but when as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's that power dynamic. I think the employees are going to require it or want it. And so companies are going to be needing to accommodate that. And the beauty is there's so much technology now to support that, to make that happen, to make the asynchronous work teams be functional and productive. And arguably it's better, right? Because you have individuals who are getting far fewer interruptions. And we know the cost of interruptions. So I'd say that's a pretty darn good bet too, Peter. And you know, for that, I'm gonna rely on you, because you placed a bet 9 years ago, and you're perhaps a little more clairvoyant than I've ever been in my life. So, yeah, you have a crystal ball. Exactly.
Expands like a quantum computer and gets back.
Yeah.
Well, it was a great discussion, Steph. Thank you for the great insights. I'm sure our listeners would appreciate it. I wish you good luck being even more systematic and measurable. And as you initially said, you know, making sure that people have courage to speak up and the guarantee that they will be heard. And then performance and joy, everything unfolds. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Peter. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and your listeners, and great work on virtual power teams.
Cool. Okay. That's all, folks.